إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله فقد قال الله تعالى بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا فقد قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقيه واحد أشد على الشيطان من ألف عابد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to my brothers and sisters. Today, inshallah, I want to share some reflections and some thoughts on the late Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi rahimahullah ta'ala. Things that perhaps we can reflect upon and take from his life of service to scholarship, to knowledge, and to the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. As I quoted the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the beginning, that one scholar, faqihun wahid, one scholar is more severe upon shaitan than 1,000 individual worshippers. So there's some weakness in this hadith, but the ulama mention it has strength in supporting narrations. But the meaning is sound. Individual worshippers who obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, maybe in the privacy of their own homes or the privacy of their own lives, shaitan wants to misguide them, no doubt. However, one scholar can guide thousands of individual worshippers, whereas an individual worshipper generally just keeps himself to himself or herself to herself and her family or his family. And so one scholar can be the means of guiding thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people just through one scholar. And so shaitan is going after the ulama. Shaitan is going after the scholars in a way. He's got a strategy or a method of attacking ulama or people of knowledge that he has a different strategy to normal people, because they're a high priority target. And anyone, and to be honest, it can be ilm and scholarship, but anyone involved attached to the deen of Islam, they are trying to help, support, whatever it might be. Shaitan wants to bring you down, because if you are supporting the deen of Islam, if you're supporting the ummah, the Muslims in whatever capacity, be it in a charitable organization, be it in a local community organization, be it in a knowledge institute of knowledge, whatever it might be, you in some capacity represent Islam. And so because of that representation, Shaitan knows if he takes you down, he's not just taking you down, he's taking lots of people who look up to you. So this is an important thing to remember, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honors if you embark in this field of supporting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, in whatever capacity, Allah is with you. Allah will be give you barakah in your life, support you in your financial, your social, all these matters. But it comes with a test as well. And so today I want to talk about the late Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the most influential scholars in the last century. He died at the age of 96, but in a Hijri calendar, he actually was 100 years old. So he actually saw a full century in the Hijri calendar, a full century. And one of the most influential scholars in the modern world, without doubt, really, to be honest. He was accepted, or he had good relations with all different strands or groups of Muslims. They respected him for his knowledge, at least, even if they fundamentally or very strongly disagreed with him in certain points of aqaid, belief or fiqh, whatever it might be. They respected him for his knowledge, at least, his deep knowledge. He was from Egypt, born there, raised there, and he was a member of the Al-Azhar University. Right from the beginning, they've got a primary school, a secondary school, then like a high school, and then if you, depending if you wanted after that, you can go to Al-Azhar University, and that's what Sheikh al-Qaradawi did. So he was like Azhari through and through, from the primary, middle school, and to high school. Then he joined the bachelor's, what we would call a bachelor's now, and then after he completed that, he did 2 master's degrees in Adab of Quran and in Quran and the Sharia. It's not adab al-Quran, adab of the Arabic language, which is literature and Arabic language, and another master's in the Quran and the Sunnah. He ended up doing his PhD in 1973 when he was about 50 years old, so a long time after his initial graduation. Then he did his PhD in 1973 on zakah. And that PhD on zakah actually became a 2-volume book, which is translated to English. Again, very, very influential book. So he grew up his formative years as a youth in the 40s, 50s and 60s, which was a period of great unrest in Egypt society. The president, one of the presidents during these decades of the 40s, 50s and 60s was Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was a tyrant really. He locked up thousands of ulama, not hundreds, thousands of ulama, because many of the ulama were outspoken against his policies and his political methodology. And so he saw the scholars as a threat. And anyone who sees the scholars and ulama as a threat, that's a big, big issue. And so he locked up many people, and Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi rahimahullah was one of those people. He wasn't even a great scholar at that time, he was still young. So it shows you the expanse of the presidential reach to lock up scholars of the time. Even a less young Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was not a great scholar at the time worldwide, internationally, he was still locked up. He had three stretches in prison, amounting to about 1.5, 2 years he spent in prison as a political or outspoken opponent to the government and the government policies and regime. So he was never one to mince his words in regards to speaking against oppression and tyrants. He certainly did that. That being said, he wasn't sectarian. So even though he had his positions, he didn't like to exacerbate differences amongst the ummah. Those points where there is difference, yes, they exist and there's a time and place to discuss those, but he didn't like to emphasize them and make them a point to split the ummah. He tried to bring the ummah together. And he was known for popularizing something called Maqasid al-Sharia. He wasn't, Imam Shatibi is one of the most famous proponents of this concept of Maqasid al-Sharia. But Yusuf al-Qaradawi rahimahullah, he used this a lot. Maqasid al-Sharia, what it means is you go to look at the nusus, the Quran and the Sunnah, and you look at individual rulings and you say, okay, the Prophet ﷺ said this, but why did he say this? What was the underlying reason behind him saying this? And so this becomes known as the Maqasid approach. The Maqasid mean objectives of the Sharia. And so there's 5, 6, there's different categories of the Sharia. The main purposes that the Sharia attempts to preserve and to protect. And Yusuf al-Qaradawi used this a lot in his forward thinking. What Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi was known for would be for he was fully traditionally trained. He was traditionally trained as an alim of the deen, and he was by the way, he's an exceptional scholar. He graduated top of his class from high school even into his masters. And so if he wanted to be, he could have been, if he listened to whatever, if he towed the government line, he could have had anything he wanted. He was so intelligent, so clever, in high school, I think he came second in the country, second in the whole country of his high school examinations, top of his class in both his masters. So if he wanted, he could have been the Grand Mufti of Egypt, Grand Mufti of Azhar, easy. His academic credentials were unmatched. But it was just whether he was willing to toe the line, which he wasn't. So that's another important thing for people to learn from. We could say in his activism as well, we don't know for 100% sure, but he was probably tortured in prison as well, because that was the way Gamal Abdel Nasser used to treat people. Because of this kind of oppression of the government on the ulama at that time in the 50s and 60s, Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi visited Qatar. And he ended up deciding as a self-imposed exile and staying in Qatar. And he was awarded citizenship in the 70s. And he became very instrumental into the Qatari regime, in the Qatari society, setting up many of their institutes, the university, the Sharia studies that they have. He set up many of them. And if some of you look at global politics, you see Saudi Arabia and maybe UAE have got a certain approach to world politics. Qatar has taken a very different approach. And what you can say is Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi has been instrumental in that from the 70s, right from the 70s. He's been there 40 years, 50 years, been advising and guiding and being very instrumental in shaping what you see today in Qatar's kind of geopolitical approach. You can see Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi was instrumental or heavily influential in that approach. And he said that people can't accuse me of hypocrisy because like I said, had he wanted, in Egypt he could have had everything that his heart desired, but he chose not to. And even his children, his daughter and his son-in-law were imprisoned because they were related to him, to put pressure on him to change certain fatwas, change certain positions regarding political activism. But even though his daughter and his son were imprisoned, he still did not renegade on his positions, and he could have. So imagine his daughter and his son-in-law had to endure time in prison, and he still held firm to his position. In terms of scholarship specifically, he was known, as I said, everyone respected him because of his deep knowledge. He genuinely had a deep knowledge in a vast array of Islamic sciences. In all of the Islamic sciences, he was vastly qualified. And he, not only that, he ventured into pretty much every area of contemporary fiqh that the modern world needs answers and to discuss. He ventured into pretty much all of them, which is why he had such a wide impact. Not everyone, you see, ulama have different skill sets, and so you see some ulama avoid certain fields and just decide to specialize in one. And everyone's got a different capacity, but Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he went into so many different fields and researched and added to each of these fields because of his vast knowledge of Sharia and his understanding of the Sharia. And this, one of his kind of groundbreaking works, which is most famous, is his book on halal and haram in the 60s. If anyone studied formally in Islamic studies, you'll see traditional books of fiqh are very complicated, very difficult to navigate. You need a teacher, and sometimes they discuss masail that aren't really applicable in our modern times. Like in the chapter of Tahara, you'll discuss wells. How many, if a well becomes polluted, how many buckets of well water do you have to take out? So like some of these things are very difficult and abstract. And what Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi did in the 60s, he made his book Halal and Haram, which was this. He always respected the tradition. He never moved away from the tradition, but his focus was to try and make, how can we make the tradition applicable in our modern time? And his book of Halal and Haram, it's still popular to this day because he was able to take those classical traditional books of fiqh without changing the content, but changing the presentation and making it applicable to our modern time. And it's still used to, even though it's written in the 60s, it's still popular to this day. It's still popular to this day. So this is one of his most famous works. Another famous work that he had was regarding political activism. See, he wasn't just a scholar sitting in his library. He was active in the society and in the community. He wrote a book called Islamic Awakening Between Rejection and Extremism. So rejection of the nusus, of the sources, meaning secularism, and extremism, people like ISIS. He wrote this book between how do you revive the community politically and through an activist approach without going to these extremes. So he wrote a book on this. And he had this concept of wasatiyya, which means middle way or being a moderate approach. And this was his principle in fiqh, in activism. That's what he tried to live by. He wrote a book, just his latest work, most influential, was a book on jihad, which was released about 5 or 6, maybe a bit longer ago, years ago. 8 years ago maybe, but I think it's only just been translated into English, or no, it's yet to be translated into English. Sorry, this book is yet to be translated into English. And this fiqh of jihad is a 2-volume work, was written directly to refute the claims of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and those people who, because you see these groups, they use nusus of the Quran and the Sunnah, and they use precedent of ulama of the past. And so when they present that to people, people get confused. They're like, what do we do? And so Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he did a refutation. And basically what he's saying is you can't just take fatwa and positions in the 10th century and just apply them in the 21st century without any context and understanding. And that's what he was about. And so his book on jihad is a very important book. When it gets translated into English, I think it will be a great resource for people to look into. And so it stopped and it saved average Muslims from falling into these confusions and these shubahat and these doubts that were coming on. at the time. And obviously you can imagine this book gained him many death threats, so his life was at stake. And those people to this day are happy that he has passed away because he spoke against them. But you can't call him a sellout because he spoke actively against the Israeli occupation, the wars in Iraq from US and UK. So he wasn't. He spoke with his personal convictions with sincerity. He called out oppression when he saw oppression. He had this forward-thinking approach because every time in his activism, when the radio first came out and channels and you started to get regular broadcasts, he started doing regular radio broadcasts. When TV came out, he was one of the first to start doing regular TV broadcasts. When the TV became satellite TV, he was one of the first to have satellite TV channel, then the internet. So you see, every time the technology changed, he adapted his activism and his da'wah to match the times. So he's always been doing that from the 50s and the 60s. That's been his attitude, is to be active and to move with the times, to keep Sharia. We cannot move away from our tradition, but how do we apply it in our modern times? That's the key thing. What can change, what can't change? And to be honest, in the whole world today, answering this question, the whole life is about change. What can change, what can't? And even in the UK, what can change and what can't may be different to perhaps in Afghanistan or Malaysia. And so this is the hardest thing really the ulama have today, and for people to understand what works in the UK won't work in Afghanistan, what works in Malaysia is not going to work in South America. And understanding this is the goal of the ulama. And this definitely was Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi's main effort. His care, his activism, his care for the ummah was amazing because he's from the Muslim world, but he cared a lot for the Muslims living as minorities in the West. And he set up many fiqh councils. So he set up the European Fiqh Council. He set it up and he was a president over it to help the Muslim ulama of the Western world, the minorities living in the Western world, to answer the issues pressing against the Muslims in the minority, as minorities in the West. So he didn't have to do that, but he had that concern. He set up the International Union of Muslim Scholars, which is another fatwa council or a council of ulama. He set that up and presided over it just until 2-3 years ago. He had to resign because of ill health. So he set up he's bringing people together and ulama together to benefit the people. He had this and this concern for people in the West living as minorities. He really took it as a personal ambition to help. So many people's fatwas on mortgages from the 70s, he was one of the first people to introduce this, obviously with all the conditions and all the rest of it. But Yusuf al-Qaradawi was one of the first. People rely on his fatwa even to this day. You see that his care for the people in the West, even though he would criticize the Western regimes, he still would care for the people and how can they live their life practically with Islam despite the difficulties that they are facing. And you see all the different ulama from different strands, they respected him. Ibn Baz respected him, Abu Hassan al-Nadawi, Mufti Taqi Usmani. These are all people with different kind of backgrounds, but they all respected Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And so in that itself is something to reflect upon. And look, many of in his book Halal and Haram, maybe, I don't know, 80% of it is fine. Maybe 20% people disagree very strongly with him. And many people did disagree with him. But that's fine. This is the whole point. To disagree strongly is absolutely fine. It's encouraged to disagree strongly. But that never breaks the bonds of brotherhood and love and respect. And I think that's another thing we can learn, very, very important from the life of Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. He was a strong advocate for Muslim countries to have their own independence and have no interference from foreign powers. He was a strong advocate for that, and he was against these dictators. He wanted to push this kind of political activism where he wanted like a democratic voting system, but an Islamic shura of ulama applying the Sharia appropriately, but a form of voting that the people can vote. But who are they voting? A shura. And so obviously the dictators didn't like this at all, which is why he became enemy number one. But this is what he used to stand up and speak for the benefit of the people against the injustices around the world. we could speak for so much about his life, but just to kind of summarize, and we'll finish here, that we see that he had this deep knowledge of Sharia and the modern times, and it's to try and bridge this gap between the modernity and the challenges we face and not losing our tradition. And he had deep knowledge and a commitment to study. This is one thing that we should have, is this deep commitment to ilm, to knowledge, preserving our tradition, but maintaining a practical application of Islam in the modern world. Another thing we can learn from his life, you cannot please everyone. You will and you will never please everyone. Anyone who tries to please everyone will fail. And so you should be sincere, have knowledge, seek knowledge of your peers and your elders, and with your sincere convictions move forward. That's what you should do. All of us should do. If you try and please people and everyone, you'll always fall short. And taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your personal taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ilm and shura with elders and peers, and then move forward, inshaAllah. Allah will bless you. Speaking the truth in the face of oppression and power, who are people who are doing wrong. This is another thing he did. He had a very deep concern from the ummah, a concern for the ummah, for people who were not from his part of the world. Setting up these European fit councils, and he's from the Middle East. Why? Concern for the ummah, concern for the future. This is how we should have a concern for the Muslims in Birmingham in 3, 4, 5 generations. How will they be? This is how we have to think. We can learn that differing positions, and like I said, people differed with him very strongly, and people disagree with him to this day of some of his fatwa positions very strongly, but that's okay. And that shouldn't be a source of issue of love and mahabba and respect for ilm. This tradition is based on ikhtilaf. We have ikhtilaf amongst all our ulama, and it should be respected. And seeing with Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, we can see that. You don't have to agree with all his positions. That's fine. Disagree. But understanding that love and respect and that deep knowledge. And finally, is this revival of the ummah. Concern for the ummah for the generations to come. Because if we do not adapt, then the Muslims in the future will have nothing as a legacy to take from us as a generation. And it will be our job to pass to the next generation, their generation to pass to the next one. Unless we do our work, then the ummah will not be able to survive. And so it's our job, and this is what we can learn from. Another lesson we can learn from the life of Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Barakallahu li wa lakum wa li sa'il muslimin fastaghfiru innahu huwal ghafurur rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. فقد قال الله تعالى إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم أيد الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم أيد الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم أيد الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم انصر من نصر دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وجعلنا منهم واقتل من خذل دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ولا تجعلنا منهم اللهم أرنا حق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا باطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله يذكركم ودعوه يستجب لكم وذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون. Please stand up, close the gaps, make space for the brothers and sisters downstairs as well.